The dawn was a crack of rust-colored light on the horizon, splitting the bruised purple of the plains. Alara felt it on her skin before she saw it, a dry heat that promised another day of thirst. The bucket she lowered into the well came up hollow, its scrape against the stone walls a sound of finality. She stood, hands on her hips, a silhouette of weary defiance against the vast, empty land. Her gaze swept the property, a habit born of loneliness and fear. The sod house, its roof patched with hope and tar, the crooked fence posts, the skeletal remains of a cottonwood tree by the dry creek bed. It was there, beneath the cottonwood's barren arms, that the shape lay. It was not a rock. It was not a dead coyote. It was a man, sprawled face down in the dust as if the earth had finally claimed him. Her first instinct was to retreat, to bolt the door and gather her son, Leo, into the dark safety of their small home. Trouble came in the shape of men. She knew this better than anyone, but she did not move. Something in the stillness of the form, the absolute surrender, held her captive. She walked, her boots scuffing the parched ground, the sound loud in the morning silence. He wore city clothes, now ruined with dirt and a darker stain that spread across his back like a morbid shadow. She knelt, her calloused fingers finding the pulse in his neck. It was there, a faint, frantic bird beating against her skin. With a strength she didn't know she still possessed, she rolled him over. His face was a mask of grit and dried blood, his breath a shallow, rasping sound. His coat was open, revealing a white shirt soaked through with red from 3 distinct, terrible holes in his chest. A detective's star, tarnished and bent, was pinned to his vest. She looked up at the empty horizon, then back at the dying man. Leaving him was a death sentence. Helping him could be one for her and Leo. Her son's face, pale and silent, flashed in her mind. He hadn't spoken a word in the year since they'd buried his father on the rise behind the house. She couldn't bring another ghost into his world. But as she watched the man's chest struggle for another breath, she saw the ghost was already here. With a grunt, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag him toward the house, a long, desperate trail scoring the dust behind them. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of earth and dried herbs. Leo was sitting at the small wooden table, tracing patterns in a spill of flour, his eyes wide and dark. He watched her haul the stranger onto the cot, his small body frozen. He didn't make a sound. Alara worked with a grim efficiency. She fetched the whiskey, the knife, and the clean rags she saved for emergencies. This was an emergency. She poured liquor onto the wounds, earning a low groan from the man. With the tip of her knife sterilized in the fire, she began to probe for the first bullet. It was a brutal intimacy, her hands digging into the flesh of a man whose name she did not know. He thrashed, his mind lost in a fever dream, muttering words she couldn't catch, fragments of a life she couldn't imagine. Then, a name clear and cold. Sterling. Her hands stilled. Her blood ran cold. Sterling, the oil baron whose shadow fell over the entire territory. The man who'd offered her husband a pittance for this land before Thomas had been found dead, trampled by stampeding cattle that left no tracks. She pulled the first piece of lead from his chest, dropping it with a clink into a tin bowl. 2 more to go. Her resolve hardened. This was not a stranger anymore. This was a reckoning, delivered bleeding to her door. The man, Silas, drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days. Alara tended to him, changing his dressings, forcing water and thin broth between his cracked lips. Leo was her silent shadow, watching from the doorway. He never got close, but his gaze never left the wounded man on the cot. On the 4th morning, Silas's eyes opened and stayed open. They were clear, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, weary pain that had nothing to do with the holes in his chest. He looked at her, then his gaze moved past her to the boy standing in the shadows. He didn't speak. He just watched Leo, a flicker of understanding passing between them, the wounded and the silent. Alara placed a cup of water on the crate beside the cot. "Drink," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. He pushed himself up slowly, his face tight with pain. Where am I? Nowhere he'll find you, she answered, her meaning clear. His eyes met hers. He! You said the name. Sterling, a muscle worked in his jaw. He took the water, his hand shaking slightly. Thank you. I didn't do it for you, she said, turning away to stoke the fire. It was a lie, but a necessary one. She felt his eyes on her back. The boy, he said, his voice a low rasp. He your son? Alara nodded, her back still to him. He doesn't talk. I know the look, Silas said softly. He's seen things a boy shouldn't see, she turned then, her expression a careful blankness. We all have. The days that followed settled into a quiet, tense rhythm. Silas healed slowly. The pain was immense, but he bore it with a stoicism that matched the landscape. He would sit on the edge of the cot for hours, watching her. He saw the way she moved, the economy of her motion, the relentless drive that kept her fetching water from a nearly dry well, mending clothes that were more patched than fabric, cultivating a garden that fought to survive in the baked earth. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, a map of her grief and struggle. He also saw Leo. The boy began to orbit the cot, drawing closer each day. He'd leave small offerings on the crate beside Silas. A hawk's feather, a strangely shaped stone, a dried wildflower. He never spoke, never made eye contact, but the gifts were a language all their own. One afternoon, Silas was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of scrap wood with a knife Alara had given him. Leo stood nearby, watching the slivers of wood curl and fall. Without a word, Silas held out the half-formed shape. It was a bird, crude but recognizable. Leo took a hesitant step forward, his small hand reaching out. He took the bird, his fingers tracing its wooden wings. He looked up, and for the first time his eyes met Silas's. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. From her place by the clothesline, Alara watched, a knot in her throat loosening for the first time in a year. The next day, Silas was on his feet, unsteady but determined. He walked to the section of fence that had been broken for months. He found the post-hole digger and, with painful, deliberate movements, began to set a new post. Alara came out of the house. You'll open your wounds, he didn't stop. He positioned the post, his face pale with sweat. A fence needs to be whole, he said, not looking at her. Or it's no fence at all. She stood there for a long moment, then went to the barn and returned with the hammer and nails. They worked together in silence. The only sounds the thud of the digger, the sharp report of the hammer, the rasp of their breathing under the oppressive sun. They were two broken people, mending a broken thing, and in the shared labor, a fragile trust began to form. It was not built on words, but on the quiet understanding of shared burdens. That night, the wind picked up, howling around the small house like a hungry wolf. A storm was coming. The air was thick with dust and electricity. Inside, the fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Leo was asleep on his pallet, the wooden bird clutched in his hand. Silas sat at the table, cleaning his bent detective star with a soft cloth. They killed your husband, he said, the words dropping into the quiet room like stones. Alara, who was staring into the flames, did not flinch. I know. His name was Thomas, Silas continued, his voice low and heavy with remorse. He wouldn't sell. He was a good man. He stood up to Sterling. I was investigating his death. It was listed as an accident. It wasn't. He looked up from the star, his eyes finding hers in the firelight. I had proof. A ledger. Names, dates, payments. Everything. Sterling's man, Cale, was supposed to buy it from me. I thought I could trap him. Instead, he brought 3 men with him. He touched his chest absently. I hid the ledger before they found me. It's safe. What is justice worth, detective? She asked, her voice hollow. Everything, he said, his voice fierce with a conviction that seemed to be all he had left. It's all that's left when they take everything else. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw the ghost that haunted him. It wasn't just Thomas. It was a line of ghosts, of cases unsolved, of victims without justice. He was a wounded healer, seeking to mend the world to somehow mend himself. Outside, the storm broke. Dust and rain lashed against the house in a furious torrent. The world outside their small window dissolved into a brown, swirling chaos. It was as if the storm had been waiting, a physical manifestation of the violence that was coming for them. A sharp crack, not thunder, split the air. The sound of a horse neighing in terror cut short. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his body tensing. He grabbed the old shotgun Alara kept over the mantel. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. "Get Leo." Stay away from the windows. Fear, cold and familiar, seized Alara. But then she looked at Silas, his battered body standing as a shield between her and the storm, and a different feeling rose to meet it. A cold, hard rage. They had taken her husband. They would not take her son. They would not take this house, this last piece of a life she had clawed out of the dirt. She woke Leo, pulling him into the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. "Stay here," she whispered, her hand on his cheek. "Don't make a sound." His eyes were wide with terror, but he nodded, clutching his wooden bird. The front door splintered, kicked in by a heavy boot. A man stood silhouetted against the swirling dust, a long coat flapping in the wind.
Kale.
His face was cruel, a scar cutting through one eyebrow. "Thorn," he called out, his voice dripping with malice. "I know you're in here. The boss wants his paperwork back. And he wants you dead." This time for good, another man slipped in behind him, rifle raised. Silas fired from the shadows of the bedroom doorway. The shotgun blast was deafening in the small space. The second man fell, a cry choked off in his throat. Cale dove for cover behind the overturned table, firing his pistol blindly into the darkness. "You're a hard man to kill, Thorn. But this homesteader and her brat won't be so lucky." The threat hung in the air, more potent than gunpowder. Silas knew Cale would make good on it. He was trapped, wounded, outnumbered, and protecting the only two people who had shown him kindness in a world that had left him for dead. Alara, hidden in the pantry, watched through a crack in the door. She saw another of Cale's men trying to circle around the back of the house. She grabbed the heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. When the back door creaked open, she swung with all the force of her grief and rage. The pan connected with the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled without a sound. Back in the main room, Cale and Silas exchanged fire in the gloom. Splinters flew from the walls. A bullet grazed Silas's arm, and he hissed in pain. He was weakening, his movements growing slower. Cale knew it. He burst from behind the table, charging forward. Silas got a shot off, hitting Cale in the leg, but the big man's momentum carried him forward. He slammed into Silas, and the two men fell to the floor, wrestling for control of the shotgun. The gun went off, blowing a hole in the ceiling. Cale, grunting, brought his pistol up, pressing it against Silas's temple. It was over, but then a floorboard creaked. Cale glanced up, distracted for a fraction of a second. From the cellar opening, Alara emerged, holding her husband's old hunting rifle. She didn't hesitate. The rifle's report echoed Cale's, but hers was the one that found its mark. Cale's eyes went wide with surprise, a dark hole appearing in his chest. He slumped sideways, his dead weight falling across Silas. Silence descended, broken only by the howl of the wind and the ragged sound of Silas's breathing. Alara dropped the rifle and rushed to him, pushing Cale's body off. Silas was alive, bleeding from the new wound on his arm, but alive. The storm began to subside as dawn approached. The wind died down, and a clean, rain-washed light filtered through the broken door. Alara was tending to Silas's arm, her touch gentle. The house was a wreck, a testament to the battle they had survived. From the cellar, Leo emerged. He walked slowly, hesitantly, across the debris-strewn floor. He stopped beside the cot where Silas lay. He looked at the man who had fought for them, at the woman who had protected him. He reached out a small, trembling hand and placed it on Silas's arm, next to the fresh bandage. Silas opened his eyes, his gaze locking with the boy's. Leo's lips parted. A small, raspy sound emerged, the first he had made in over a year. "Stay," he whispered. The word was a fragile miracle in the quiet room. It was a plea, a question, and an answer all at once. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. She reached out, her hand covering both Leo's and Silas's. 3 hands, scarred and weary, joined together in the morning light. Months later, the sun shone on a different scene. The fence was whole, its new wood weathering to a soft gray. The house was repaired, the door solid on its hinges. Near the well, a small patch of green defied the dry earth, a testament to a well that was no longer completely empty. On the porch, Silas sat carving another small animal from a piece of wood. He was still thin, and a limp would always be with him, but his eyes were clear. Beside him, Leo chattered away, a stream of questions and observations about the world he was rediscovering. Alara stood by the doorway watching them. A genuine smile touched her lips. The ghosts had not vanished, but they no longer haunted the daylight. They had found their justice. In the ruins of their separate pasts, in the shared silence and the violent storm, they had forged something new. A family, born not of blood, but of resilience, courage, and the simple, profound promise of a single word. Stay.